Hi, and welcome to your next lecture. This one is on social theory. And whenever we study social theory, there's always people who like theory more than others, but there's a couple reasons why we take the time to talk about it. And one is that in order to move forward in sociology and look at the issues like a sociologist, it's worthwhile to look at what other people have said before us and to kind of try to see what the different worldviews are so that we can interpret the things that we study later in light of those. And also, you can start to develop your own sense of what you think really makes society tick and what best explains the world. In other words, as we're going through these theories, you can say, well, that makes sense to me, or that doesn't make sense to me. And you can start to form your own worldview, and in that way start to be able to move forward as a sociologist yourself. So we start with these early European theorists because they were the first ones to really talk about sociology. And the very first sociologist was a fellow named Auguste Comte. He was a Frenchman, and he was writing in the late 1700s, and he was really more of a philosopher, I guess you'd say. He was also a mathematician. But his idea was that he wanted to take the ideas from the other sciences, the hard sciences, the natural sciences as they're often called, things like physics and biology and chemistry. And he wanted to take those same methods that are used in those sciences and apply them to the study of society. And so, really, the word sociology is a word he came up with. Also, the word social science is a word he came up with in order to, say that we can take these methods and these ideas from the other sciences and use them to talk about sociology or about society. For this reason, Comte is often referred to as being the father of sociology because he's the guy who came up with the word. He borrowed fairly heavily from a couple of other sciences, and I'm only going to talk a little bit about one and a bit more about the other. The first one is physics. He borrowed a lot of ideas from the science of physics, and in particular, he talked about social statics and social dynamics. Statics and dynamics, if you've ever studied physics, you know that those are two big terms that are used to describe the states of matter and states of energy. Things that are static are at rest, or they're potential energy. So you've heard the term static electricity, where you build up this charge before you go up and shock somebody. That electricity that you're building up is static. It stays the same until you're near something where you can discharge that energy. So Comte said we can take that same idea of statics and dynamics, statics being things that stay the same, and then dynamics being things that change. If you have somebody with a dynamic personality, that means that they're very lively and constantly changing. So he said that we can take that idea and talk about things in society that are static and dynamic. And so obviously there's things in society that do stay the same. I mean, the whole idea of a family, for instance, is something that has endured as long as we've had human society. So there's always been some form of family. Now, that family may look different for different people. It doesn't have to be mommy, daddy, 2.3 kids, and a dog and a cat, but it's something that is responsible for the raising of children and for the transmission of culture, which is what a family is really all about. And then, of course, there are also things that are dynamic in our society, things that are always changing, and that's easier to see because it seems like, with the speed of technology, that there are many things in our society that don't stay the same. The actual look of what a family looks like has changed over time. So the idea of a family itself is kind of static, but what that family may look like, in the 1800s, extended families were very common, and you'd have cousins and aunts and uncles and grandparents and all that living together in one house, and you just don't see that anymore. So the way that the family is actually manifested looks different now. So that's kind of dynamic, but the idea of the family itself is static. It stayed the same. So that's one thing he took from physics. But he borrowed even more heavily from the science of biology, and he describes society as being like an organism. And if if you're in nursing or medicine or any of these other fields where you study the human body, you know that as an organism, human beings are made up of lots of different parts, lots of different systems, and that each of these systems is supposed to perform some sort of function for the body. So you have a circulatory system that is supposed to be sending blood and carrying oxygen to parts of the body. You have a respiratory system that has to do with your breathing. You have a nervous system. You have all these different systems, and they all work together. And if one of them goes down, I mean, if your digestive system suddenly shuts down, you're not able to process food anymore. And all the other systems in your body will suffer, and you'd eventually die if your digestive system isn't repaired. Comte said that, like a human body, or any of these other systems I've got pictured here, the one in the middle, that's a map of Manhattan in New York with the subway system, and there's a car from the bottom showing all the different systems. According to Comte, society is just like any of those complex systems. It has lots of parts, and all of those parts work together. And if one of those parts fails, like during the 9/11 terrorist attack, when the political system had some problems, because obviously nobody was sure how to react to this, and everybody was distraught, and nobody felt safe, that all the other parts of society had to pull together in order to repair that system and to bring it back into equilibrium, which is what happened over time. It took a few years, but eventually American society recovered. So if you think of society as being like a big organism with all these different parts, then you understand what Comte was talking about. Okay, the second major theorist, early European theorist, was Karl Marx. And most of you have probably heard of Karl Marx because he's very associated with the idea of communism. But before Karl Marx was, kind of a political hot potato, he was a sociologist. And he had a very different worldview than Auguste Comte did. For Marx, everything in society can be explained through class conflict. Specifically, he said that there were really only two classes of people. There were the bourgeoisie, who he said these were the rich people, the people who owned what he called the means of production, which in those days would have meant factories. So these were the capitalists, the factory owners who had lots of money. And then on the other side, you had the group that he referred to as the proletariat. And the proletariat were all the people who worked for those capitalists, for the bourgeoisie, the workers, in other words, the working class, the poor people. And according to Marx, you could really, if you wanted to understand what society was all about, it was about conflict between those two groups, especially the exploitation of the workers by the people who owned those factories, those means of production. And he said that in an unfair system like capitalism, where you have all the power and the money at the top in the hands of a very few people, and then you have the class of workers who are really doing all the work and not getting fair pay for that, that was an unfair system and that it led to conflict. And he also thought eventually it would lead to a revolution. So this idea of class consciousness, what Marx meant by that, and then he outlined this in his famous book, The Communist Manifesto. Class consciousness was the idea that eventually that working class, that proletariat, would realize that they were being oppressed, and that when they did, they'd become conscious of the fact that they were part of this oppressed class, and that when they did, it would lead to an inevitable revolution, and that this revolution would be a workers' revolution. The workers would rise up and take over and overthrow the oppressors, the bourgeoisie who owned the means of production, and they would form their own society. And for Marx, that society should be totally equal. And one of the only ways you can make sure the society is totally equal is to do away with the whole concept of private property. Because if you have private property, you've always got someone who owns more than someone else. And so for Marx, you had to do away with that whole idea and make everything be owned collectively. That's where the name communism comes from. Your communal ownership of everything the society owns. And so he said, if everybody gives to the society the talents that they have and only take from the society what they need, you kind of help your neighbor and your neighbor helps you and you all share the resources that you have, that when that happens, you really didn't need a government anymore at all. So Marx really saw that the government would go away completely. He called it a withering away of the state. And this withering away of the state would mean that eventually everyone would just live in peace and harmony without the need for a government at all. Now, this surprises a lot of people who think of communism as being, China or the Soviet Union, because they obviously have very strong, or had very strong, central governments that, in many ways look like a fascist state or a totalitarian state, dictatorship. So, in reality, Marx's ideas, when applied, never really led to what he said they would lead to, which was a complete doing away of the government. And probably that's one of the biggest criticisms of Marx's theories, is that in reality, they didn't work out the way they were supposed to. There's lots of reasons why that may have occurred. One is that Marx underestimated human nature and our desire to hold on to power once we have it. And another is that, there have been some changes since Marx's day. When Marx was alive, there were no workers' protection laws. There was no minimum wage. There was no 40-hour work week. There was no child labor laws. There were no days off with pay. There was no medical insurance. All these things that you take for granted as a modern worker didn't exist. And so Marx didn't really foresee that a society like the United States, which is capitalistic and which, we obviously have private ownership of businesses, he didn't really see that these kind of reforms would be put into place to make it more fair for the proletariat. And so there's a lot of reasons why that maybe didn't happen. By the way, if you've ever read the Orwell book, Animal Farm, you may remember it's the story of where the animals take over the farm, and the pigs eventually come to rule the other animals. In that book, the pig at the very beginning of the book, named Old Major, was the Marx character. And the reason for that is, in the book, the reason I bring that up is that in the book, the Old Major pig character at the beginning has these ideas about how the animals are all going to be equal and that they'll live in harmony, and that once we overthrow the farmer, who's oppressing all of the animals, that all the animals can own the farm together. Then Old Major, the pig who represents Marx, dies off before the revolution actually takes place. And then everything goes wrong from there, and the pigs come to act just like the humans that had been in place before. Marx died long before the Russian Revolution. Marx died in the 1870s, and the Russian Revolution didn't occur until 1917. So Marx was, 40 years in the grave before anybody actually tried his ideas. He probably would have been shocked at how things played out. As a sociologist, though, he gives us a lot, because he invented a whole idea in sociology called conflict theory, which says that different groups competing for scarce resources like money are what really makes the world go round. That it wasn't like Comte had said, with different parts working together, but rather it was all about competition and conflict. One last idea from Marx that we need to talk about is his idea of economic determinism. And what he meant by economic determinism is that the economy in a particular society is the most important thing, and that all the other parts of society serve to legitimate that system, that the economy demands that all the other parts of society support it. So in a society like ours, a capitalistic society, he talked about things like religion and the family and the government all doing nothing more really in society than keeping people in line so that they'll keep feeding money into the economy. So things like the Protestant work ethic, where it's part of being godly to actually work as hard as you can. Well, that serves the economy. And so he said that, if you have a government, for instance, that isn't friendly to business, that government usually gets voted out eventually, and that a more pro-business government, as we have now, is installed. And so this is his idea, that the economy actually kind of determines what the rest of society looks like, and it supports that system. Okay, just a few more of these early European theorists, and we won't go into them nearly as deeply as Comte and Marx, because they're the two biggies. But three more people to talk about. One is named Herbert Spencer, and his idea of social Darwinism. He took the ideas of Charles Darwin, which you probably all heard of, having to do with the concepts of evolution and natural selection, and he applied them to society. And so for Spencer, the most fit members of society, which he referred to as being the wealthiest people in society, the ones who were the most successful, were naturally selected to be, more capable in society. and that there was some flaw in the individuals who ended up not being successful. In other words, the poor were poor because of some flaw in their personality or some flaw in their character. And therefore, just as in nature, they're going to be punished for that by not being as successful. And he also said that this is just the natural way of things and that we should just let it occur. So he was very against the idea of welfare, not only for a government, but he was against even, churches helping out poor people or individuals helping other individuals, because he said you're just prolonging their life and letting them reproduce, and that they're going to pass on whatever trait it is that made them unfit in society so that they're not successful. So it's kind of this was a lot of critics of this theory because it seemed very cold and it seemed very unfair to the poor, who a lot of times weren't maybe to blame for their own circumstances. And so one of his biggest critics was someone you'd heard of named Charles Dickens. And in fact, in Charles Dickens's book A Christmas Carol, he based the character Scrooge on Herbert Spencer. He actually put that character in there to kind of get people to look badly at Spencer, because he was kind of caricaturing him in the character of Scrooge, and so he was trying to sway public opinion away from Spencer and make him look like a mean old man, which maybe he was. He was certainly successful at that because public opinion did change a bit after the writings of Dickens. Another major European theorist, this time a German, was named Max Weber. Even though it looks like Weber, it's pronounced Weber. And he had lots of things to talk about. He talked a lot about that Protestant work ethic that I talked about before with Marx. But one concept I'd like you to know about that Max Weber came up with was called Verstehen, which is a German word that loosely translated into English means being, to be. And Verstehen, for Max Weber, what he was saying by, it seems like a simple word, being, but what he was saying was, if you want to be a successful sociologist, if you want to be a successful researcher, you need to be able to put yourself in your subject's shoes. You need to, if you're studying people, you need to, as much as you can, try to think like the people you're studying. Otherwise, you couldn't really understand them. You need to be like your subjects. And that's what he meant by Verstehen, that you couldn't just be totally objective and stand back and look at another group of people and study them as a sociologist without really understanding where they were coming from. And so that's what you had to do if you wanted to make accurate studies and predictions. And then finally, Emile Durkheim, also a theorist that talked about lots of other things, but I just want to concentrate on one, and that was his studies that he did on suicide. And he was interested in something that he found, which was in his native land in Germany, that two religious groups, the Protestants and the Catholics, committed suicide at very different rates. Durkheim found that Protestants living there in Germany committed suicide at a much higher rate than Catholics. And he couldn't figure out why that would be, but he studied it extensively. He came up with some theories, that Catholics had confession, which is something that Protestants didn't, and so that the Catholics would be able to, kind of get things off their chest, to release the sins that they had committed, and that by doing this, they were able to, not worry about that as much anymore, to be forgiven by their priest. And that this led to a healthier state of mind, lower stress, etc., and that Protestants not having that release and maybe not having some of the other connections in the church that the Catholics had to each other, the closer knit community, that led them to feeling alienated and guilty, and that Protestants ended up just killing themselves more often. His theories about why that actually happened are maybe not the important thing. I think the important thing is that Durkheim was the first person to say that something that people had previously thought was just an individual decision. People commit suicide because they're depressed, or because they have a chemical imbalance in their head, or because a loved one dies, or whatever. Those kind of individual reasons were what people had always looked at with suicide. Durkheim said it also matters what social groups you belong to. It makes you more or less likely to commit suicide. And so that's an important step for sociology sociology to be on the same level as psychology. You know, that these social groups are just as important as the things going on inside individuals' heads. Okay, so leaving behind the classical social theory and coming up to the modern day, based on these three theorists, or pardon me, on the theories that we were looking at, and the theorists that we were looking at from old Europe, there are now three modern social theories that kind of bring their ideas together into under one umbrella. Excuse me. The first of those is called functionalism, and functionalism is based very much on the ideas of Comte. Because what a functionalist believes is that there are lots of different parts in society, and that each of these different parts performs some function, just like the systems in an organism. And so the functionalists are always very concerned with exactly what these social structures and institutions are doing for society. What function are they performing, and how do they all fit together? How do they rely on each other? And for a good functionalist, there are definitely five basic social institutions, five pieces to this puzzle that fit together to really explain what holds society together. The first of those is the family. The family obviously is a basic institution in society. And the function of the family, when you get right down to it, is the production of offspring and the passing on of our culture to those offspring. And that's a really important thing. Even if the family isn't a mother and father and kids, you know, it doesn't matter if you were raised by your grandparents or aunts or whatever. They raised you. They took you from a tiny helpless baby to a fully functioning part of society. So that's the function that a family serves, and that's an important piece of the puzzle. There's also education. Education is another of those basic institutions. All societies have some form of education to transfer knowledge from one person to another. It doesn't have to be a classroom. It doesn't have to be an online course. It could be an apprenticeship, you know, where you follow around a carpenter to learn how to be a carpenter. But all societies have some form of education for knowledge and value transmission. So that's another basic piece of the puzzle. Then there's the economy, which has to do with goods and services and the exchange of these goods and services. This was an important one for Marx, obviously. He thought that this really explained society in general, was money, the acquisition of goods and services, and the hoarding of those to have more than your neighbor does. But the economy definitely is obviously a big part of society. It's a necessary thing because it really governs how you get the things that you need to survive, and how will you move forward as a nation as far as standard of living for your citizens and that sort of thing. Then there's religion. Religion is a basic institution. All societies, no matter how simple or complex, have some form of religion. There are lots and lots of different forms of religion, but they all perform a similar set of functions. One is value and morality and belief transmission from generation to generation, and the other is answering some unanswerable questions. Religions always deal with unknown and help to provide answers for the unknown and for what happens after we die and that sort of thing. So that's an important function in society, to answer those questions, to bring people together with a common idea of what those answers might be. And then finally, there's the political institution. I represent here with President Bush. The political institution is all about the achievement of goals as a society. There's certain things that we can do as a nation that we can't do as individuals. I mean, if we're suddenly invaded by Canada, I know it's pretty unlikely, but if it happened, as an individual, there's not much I could do about that. I could maybe get my friends and go up and fight the Canadians, but that's not going to make much of a difference. On the other hand, my government can step in and raise an army and mobilize that army and do what needs to be done to fight back the Canadians. And so that's the purpose. They're helping us to achieve goals that we couldn't achieve individually as a collective, and that's what politics is all about. So those are the five basic social institutions, and they all work together. And for a good functionalist, it's about those things being in equilibrium, about being in balance. And those different parts of society, just like in Comte's organism, all working together. And if something gets out of balance, something gets out of whack, then the other institutions kick in to bring things back into whack. So if the economy is in bad shape, maybe the political institution does something like cut taxes or institute some new program to help with bringing that back into balance. So that's sort of the idea of the functionalists. Conflict theory, on the other hand, says no, it's not about all these different parts of society working together. It's about different groups in society competing with each other for scarce resources. These are based on the ideas of Marx pretty much explicitly. And so we've gone through that a lot, so I won't go through more. I think you get the idea. It's about these different groups in society who are competing with one another and in conflict with one another. And so if you want to know if you're a functionalist or a conflict theorist, just think about when you look out your window and you look at society and you look at the world today, do you see groups in constant conflict with each other, and does that really explain social reality? Or do you see a somewhat orderly system that changes much more slowly and that is all striving for equality and equilibrium? If that's the case, you are probably a functionalist. So you can start to answer that own question yourself as you're going to do in discussion later. And then finally, the third major theory is one that is based less on the European theorists we just talked about and more on American sociologist ideas at the University of Chicago. This is known as symbolic interactionism. And symbolic interactionism focuses on the interplay, the interaction of the symbols that we use today in our day-to-day life. For instance, I'm using symbols with you right now, not only the pictures that you can see, which obviously are made up of lots of symbols, but also the very language that I'm using. If you don't speak English, the words that I'm saying to you right now are absolutely meaningless. They're nothing more than sounds. The only reason that they mean anything to you at all is that you have ascribed some meaning to those symbols. And so if I use a word you don't know, I just said ascribed. You may not know what the word ascribed means. It means that you've attached something. You've attached a meaning to it. If you don't know what a word means, it has well, it has no meaning for you. It's just meaningless. And so symbols and how they are interpreted differently by different people and the way that they interact with one another is what the symbolic interactionists are really concerned about. That's a very short explanation of symbolic interactionism. There's a much more detailed explanation of it in your book, and if you'd like to go online as well. But that's all the time we have for today. So thank you for listening.